Hello, my friends. My name is Gerdes, just a professor trying to help you understand some context in the war in Ukraine. Um, for many of us, it feels like the world's on fire. It feels like things are just spinning out of control. And I want to try to give you some perspective in this video. So, I was watching a documentary last night about North Korea because that's the kind of thing I do to relax. And I'm watching this documentary and I was struck. I had this aha moment. I'm going to read some of what they had to say here in this because if I play it, then I'll get a content strike, and I'm trying to not do that. So here, so the Korean War ends, and so the Korean War is like the early 1950s. And then in 1968, um, North Korea sends a team of commandos to try to assassinate the president of South Korea. And so I'm just going to read here what it says. Kim Il-sung ordered his most brazen military operation since signing of the 1953 armistice. A unit of highly trained North Korean commandos cut their way through barbed wire along the DMZ and snuck into the south, donning South Korean military uniforms and credentials. The commandos stormed the Blue House. Now, the Blue House is the equivalent of our White House. It's where the president resides. The private residence of President Park Chung-hee. Commandos' orders, which came directly from Kim Il-sung, were concise and explicit. The instructions were basically, go to the Blue House to kill South Korean President Park Chung-hee, to cut off his head, and bring it back to North Korea. The North Koreans got within yards of President before they were discovered. The assassination was thwarted. This is General Bonesteel speaking, and I sincerely hope Kim Il-sung and his people up north recognize the futility and unwisdom of continuing this action. But just days later, the North Koreans captured the USS Pueblo, which had been sailing off the coast of Korea. The 82-man crew was bound, blindfolded, and transported to Pyongyang, where they were charged as spies. For 11 months, the ship's crew was tortured and subjected to harsh interrogations. President Johnson said that the North Koreans committed yet another wanton aggressive act by seizing an American ship and its crew. Clearly, this cannot be accepted. By the winter of 1968, it seemed America was once again being pulled into the conflict in Korea just as the war in Vietnam was heating up. The seizure of the Pueblo happened almost conterminously with the Tet Offensive and was designed to put pressure on the U.S. by the North Koreans, who were helping the North Vietnamese. Pueblo incident kind of illustrates the dilemma that the Americans have always been in. Because we do have major interest in Korea, but we have global interests as well. And this is where we are right now in the context within Ukraine and Russia and within potentially Taiwan and China. We have interests, but we also have larger interests as well. And so we're pulled these different directions. Same song, second verse, but there's a little bit more. So the Americans were deeply engaged in Vietnam, and we're scared to death that Park Chung-hee would take some kind of action that would create a renewed Korean War, right? Like, they're trying to balance what's going on. Like, here's what's going on locally. We want to make sure you're okay, but we have to keep our eye on the bigger picture simultaneously. The Americans are bogged down in Vietnam. The Soviet Union has distractions in Eastern Europe. It invades Czechoslovakia in 1968. Yeah, we forgot about that. That's what was going on at the time. And the Chinese are involved in their Cultural Revolution. And it felt to me as I was watching this, wow, in 1968, it felt like the world was on fire. It really did. Now, I'm looking at that, and then I'm thinking this. I wake up this morning, U.S. and U.K. are hitting Houthi targets in Yemen. Like, what was going on there? Well, they're striking back because, well, lots of bad things have been happening. Here's a world map. We know about Ukraine and Russia, and this has been going on for some time. And we want to contain it. We don't want it to spill out and go elsewhere. But over the last year or so, we saw much more than that. We saw recently Venezuela was about to take something in Guyana, and it almost kicked off there. And then we saw Azerbaijan and Armenia, they had like a 7-day war. We saw what happened in Niger last year. We're keeping our eye on China and what's going on potentially with Taiwan. It depends on how the elections go, whether that's going to heat up or cool down. We're looking at the Yemenis, the Houthi rebels that are blocking trade here coming through out. I mean, lots of ships are now trying to go around Africa because of this. And of course, that's all because of Israel and Gaza. So it's really like it feels like the world's on fire. But I just want to give you some perspective. So here's a list of countries that are currently at war around the world. There's Ukraine. We know that. Palestine and Israel, we know that. Then there's Myanmar. Now, Myanmar is, and if I'm mispronouncing it, I actually had a roommate from there. It was once called Burma, but there is a civil war going on. Now, this is the last 365 days. Sudan, there's a terrorist insurgency. Nigeria, there's also a terrorist insurgency. Somalia, civil war. Now, let's go down through the list. Mexico, drug war. Syria, civil war. Mali, civil war and terrorist insurgency, right? There's a border war between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And you go down through the list, there's 40 different countries that are at war in some way, shape, or form right now in the world. So it's kind of like the weather. Like the weather fluctuates. It's hot and then it's cold and then it's hot and then it's cold. And so right now, I'm not sure which is hot and which is cold, but we seem to be in one of those 1968 kind of times. Like here's a list of, I just Googled events in 1968. 1968 was a pretty awful year. The assassination of Martin Luther King, pretty bad. Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was won militarily and lost politically and was like a driving force that reduced American support for Vietnam in a huge way. The assassination of Bobby Kennedy. Apollo 8, that was okay. Chicago Democrat Convention. Now, this is American-centric, right? Because I'm Googling in the U.S. The Chicago Democrat Convention was really chaotic. Civil Rights Act, at the time, it was very contentious, although we don't think that now. Czechoslovakia was invaded by the Soviets. Nixon wins the White House. And again, at that time, that wasn't the one where we were like, It was the second, the re-election, that was the one where you had all the shenanigans that got him not impeached. He left before he was impeached. Got him to step down. 1968 Olympics, France in turmoil. There was strikes about colleges or something there. The Prague Spring, which was also related to Soviets. Presidential election, anti-Vietnam protests, which were huge throughout 1968. LBJ bedeviled by Vietnam. The My Lai massacre. All kinds of terrible things were going on. And the reason that we're thinking, now, so things are bad. But part of the reasons that we see it as so bad right now is that we think that, well, that was then, this is now, and we think that the world's getting better. And in some ways it is. But human nature hasn't really changed. And man's not basically good. Man has done some pretty horrific things to each other over time historically, and they're still doing it. There's 40 nations involved in some state of war right now. So I think the world kind of is on fire, but it happens. It comes and goes. And while we don't want it to spread, we don't want it to get out of control. We want to make sure that we stop Russia here so it doesn't spill into Moldova or spill over NATO borders, God forbid, and create a bigger war. It's still part of the ebb and flow of how things have gone. So it's not like the end of the world's not right around the corner. It's just that we're in one of those, I don't know if we're in ebb or the flow, or I don't remember which is ebb and flow. Somebody put that in the comments. So one's higher, one's lower, but you understand my point. So I hope that that's somehow weirdly comforting, because I drew some comfort out of that when I was looking at, like, yeah, that was pretty bad then. But then we have times of relative peace, and we have times of relative war and times of relative peace again. All right, tell me what you thought about that. I hope that helped you with some context, with some ability to see things with a little bit more hope, knowing that it's not just all falling apart. Sometimes when you widen the aperture and you expand your view, you see things in better perspective. Okay, tell me what you thought. Put it in the comments below. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.